Great. Thank you very much, Ruth, and thank you for that kind introduction. It's great to be here, and it's great to be on this panel, this very distinguished panel, and it was great to be asked by Manny and Francis to come, and always good to be with them and so many other friends here in New York. We have the panel today is about the global economic crisis and the labor movement's response to it, I think. And so I want to talk a little bit about the crisis and a little bit about our response to it, or not enough response to it. We've neglected a rich opportunity to condemn unregulated, deregulated, unfettered free market capitalism. The current global financial crisis was caused by allowing Wall Street to become the largest casino in the world, gambling with the wealth of our nation, and indeed the world's wealth. The losses challenge our comprehension. $2 trillion in this country, $50 trillion worldwide, and we cannot restore any real economic security until we restore consumer demand by reversing decades of growing inequality and allowing workers here and across the globe to keep more of the wealth that they create and more of the fruits of increasing productivity. As Reverend Jackson would say, we are living right now in a teachable moment. A moment when unfettered, deregulated, free market capitalism is and has discredited itself, and we are not doing a good enough job of driving home the point. We cannot let Americans, nor indeed the world, forget what has happened. The truth is that Wall Street banks gambled with our nation's wealth with phony investment instruments and ridiculous leverage formulas and destroyed trillions of dollars of the nation's and the world's wealth. We are too timid to criticize capital or the failures of capitalism. And now we cannot lift ourselves out of this mess, 15, 20 million people in America out of work with no signs of jobs coming back, because average Americans no longer have enough money to drive the American economic engine. Americans, according to our own polling, don't care about the deficit. Americans want jobs and economic security. The pundits care about the deficit. The talking heads care about the deficit, but Americans and American workers want jobs and economic security. To do that, we have to reverse 30 or 40 years of faulty, stupid economic thinking and policy, because Americans no longer have enough money to drive this economy. Even Alan Greenspan admitted that his free market ideology, shunning certain regulations, was flawed, and that's a quote from testimony he gave in October of 2008. The last decade, the first decade of the 21st century, was a disaster for America's working families. According to the Washington Post, the U.S. had zero job growth in the last decade, when every previous decade for the last 60 years had job growth of at least 20%. Working families suffered declining wages, that after 20 years of stagnant wages and declining net worth of family wealth in spite of increasing productivity. This decade of disaster followed 20 years of stagnant wages. Put together, working families in America have suffered at least 30 years of assault on our standard of living, quality of life, assault on our unions and our jobs. Many of us have felt this in our own lives, with grown children moving back in with their families, with families splitting up so various members can find work in various other places. The numbers tell the complete story. As everyone in this room knows, we now have somewhere between 48 and 50 million Americans without health care, more than we've had since we passed Medicare in 1965, and another 40 million with inadequate or unreliable health care. The buying power of our wages is lower today than in 1973. Worker productivity has gone up by 75% in the last 30 years, while our wages have stagnated and declined. 20% more Americans live in poverty today than 10 years ago. And while American CEOs made 40 times as much as the average worker in 1980, today American CEOs make about 420 times as much as the average worker. All of this is the result of 30 years of a sustained, intentional, strategic assault. We need to do several things to lift our country out of this economic crisis, but they all involve finding a way to get more money into the pockets of working folks. We need to rebuild our industrial and manufacturing capacity and create good union middle-class jobs. As everyone who's ever taken Economics 101 knows, you create wealth by making things, by taking raw materials and working with them to create things that other people want to buy. We need to invest in new sources of renewable and sustainable energy to create 2 million good new jobs and reduce our dependence on foreign oil. We need to restore the freedom of American workers to organize unions, and that means passing the Employee Free Choice Act and reforming the Railway Labor Act and passing public sector collective bargaining and widening the number of people who are covered by the National Labor Relations Act. And as everyone here knows, we need real reform of our healthcare industry, and real reform means single payer. Also critical to our nation's security and economic future and health is the conversion as much as possible to green energy generation and use. We could create 2 million good-paying union jobs, harnessing the wind that never stops blowing across the plains of North and South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and that can create electricity, the sun that never stops shining in Arizona. China, by the way, according to the Secretary of Energy, is now spending $2 billion a month harnessing the wind. And so, just to conclude, unfettered, deregulated capital is always ultimately disastrous. Not since 1919 has inequality of wealth and income been so huge in America. We must have policy and political action that reverse the last 30 years of trickle-down economics and the transfer of wealth from the middle and the bottom to the top. It is in America's interest, and indeed the world's, for workers to have more money to spend to restore consumer demand and real economic growth and to stimulate the economy. That is why we must continue to fight for the Employee Free Choice Act and the reform of our labor laws to allow workers in every economic sector to freely organize and bargain collectively. That is why we must, no matter what happens today, continue to fight for single-payer health care. And that is just one reason we must fight for sustainable energy that can fuel a sustainable economy. And that is why we must rebuild industrial and manufacturing capacity to get back to creating wealth by making things. And that is why we must never let anyone forget that the forces of the market left to themselves destroy people and communities and entire economies. Thank you.
Okay, now we'll turn to Ron Blackwell from the AFL-CIO.